Now, we just spoke with Congressman Himes, who sits on the committee in question here, about some of at least the new moves and some of the consequences that will be happening on Capitol Hill. Now let's take a look at some of the legal aspects. The war between the president, the FBI, the intelligence community certainly has never been good, but it has intensified over the Nunes Memo. Former CIA Director John Brennan, he incensed by the whole thing. He sent the following tweet this morning. I had many fights with congressional Dems over the years on national security matters, but I never witnessed the type of reckless partisan behavior I am now seeing from Devin Nunes and House Republicans. For his part, Leon Panetta, former CIA chief, defense secretary, and Clinton chief of staff, he said the following, quote, what's happening now is a total breakdown in the procedure because when they move ahead to release some classified information, it truly does jeopardize the sources and methods that are used to gather intelligence. Now, in a couple of minutes, we're also talking about the new developments in the Mueller probe, including the new people on Team Trump now in the unwanted spotlight. But first, I want to talk more about the Nunes Memo with former federal prosecutor Mimi Rocah. She is now a professor at Pace Law School. In fact, just came from a class. So I have a bunch of questions, but from your end, as somebody that was part of justice here, what is most concerning about not only the turn of events, but the willingness to go where really we haven't gone before?
Right. So, I mean, there's so many things that are concerning. I think you could kind of break them into two categories. One is process and the other is substance. The process, which has now been, in the news and we've been talking about for several days, although it feels like weeks, of this decision by this committee, really by Nunes, to declassify, release classified information without giving the originator, the author of that information, if you will, the opportunity to really do a deep dive and decide what the consequences of that are going to be.
And just to remind the audience, what Mimi's referencing is the FBI director and the deputy director offered and sought the audience with Nunes and the committee to fully explain the intelligence that went before it. Reportedly, Nunes never even read the intelligence. It was his aides who put this report together, which by all accounts was a highly partisan one. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's the context.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot to break down. So I think that is obviously just very, very disturbing, to say the least, for a couple of reasons. One, I don't think anyone but the FBI knows what the consequences are going to be to the sources that may or may not be revealed in that memo. Now, look, is it possible that the FBI would look at it, take a deep dive in it, and say, you know what, with these few redactions, it would be okay. There's not going to be any serious consequences. I haven't heard anyone say that, but I'm just saying that is a possible outcome. But when does that happen, that they don't get the opportunity to do that? And that, as the FBI themselves said in a letter, that's just extremely reckless. And then a sort of consequence of that is, just like in any other kind of criminal or intelligence investigation, once you show that the government as a whole body, whether we're talking about Department of Justice and Congress together here, have lost control basically of the ability to shield sources, that's going to jeopardize future investigations and gathering of information that every American should want our government to be able to get. So sources, whether they're sources in terrorism investigations, whether they're here in the United States or abroad, they're going to look at this. I mean, this is everywhere. They're going to hear this, and they're going to be afraid.
Before we move on to substance, on the process side, the part that was confusing, and then I heard echoed by another former justice official, they said roughly the same thing. If the reporting is to believe, Carter Page was the person of interest that they were doing. First off, he already was a subject that was under investigation by the Mueller team. Then the other concern is that they used, allegedly, the dossier as a means to get the FISA court. Two things. First off, every day in criminal investigations, you talk to snitches, you talk to fellow criminals, you talk to unsavory types or whatever information that can help you in in the process of an investigation, you're going to use that as a potential resource. So why that would be excluded, I don't know. But moreover, this idea that a FISA court, some guy they throw a file in, somebody stamps it without looking and says, go with God, that's not how it works. Can you explain that this is an intricate process, and the concern now with it is not only is it complicated, much more so than was described, but it's also confidential.
Right.
And if opening this up the way it is discredits both the FISA process, but also going forward could possibly complicate the secrecy of it.
Yeah. So I actually was going to put this in the substance bucket,
Okay.
but maybe it shows my buckets aren't perfect. In other words, what we're talking about now is once this memo comes out, forgetting how it gets there, let's assume it comes out. What's the takeaway from it? Well, the Republicans, certainly Nunes, is going to say it discredits the whole Mueller investigation. How is that possible? Because I presumably, obviously, haven't seen it, but from what I glean, it's going to say something about how the origins of that investigation, those investigations that were already going on, including of Carter Page and maybe others, where they sought a FISA. And presumably, Christopher Wray, again, the reporting is that he was involved in seeking reauthorization of that FISA, and somehow that's going to discredit him. I think that's the idea that they're going to use it for. Well, seeking a FISA warrant, as you say, like any other warrant, Title III type of warrant, a phone type of warrant where you're listening in on the words of someone you suspect of some kind of criminal activity, has many, many layers of review. It is not up to one FBI agent, one prosecutor, even one, FBI director. It is up to, there are many internal layers of review first within the Department of Justice. I mean, just as a prosecutor in an ordinary criminal case, I would have to go to something called the Office of Enforcement Operations at the Department of Justice. After getting many layers of review within my own office, they would have to review it. And there, there's many requirements and layers of review and back and forth. So there's internal reviews, and then it goes to a judge. A federal, district court judge in most criminal cases, and in this case, a FISA court judge. Those judges require you to source every piece of information in your warrant. The idea that in your application for your warrant. So and there's back and forth. They will test it. They will ask you questions about it if there's any kind of uncertainty about it. So it's a very rigorous process, and the idea that any one person could have somehow tainted that original application, I think is pretty far-fetched. And then with respect to FISAs, you have to get those reauthorized every 90 days. And in order to get it reauthorized, you have to show a continuation. You can't go back and rely on the original, what you used for the original probable cause. So that means that the original warrant, was issued, and then there was more activity that made a judge think, yeah, there's reason to keep doing this.
Is the concern here, to me, first of all, I think you laid it out. There's the short game, but then the end game is Rosenstein, you can't be trusted, right? And as a consequence, you gotta go. Put somebody else in. That person's the person that Mueller reports to. Rosenstein already said there's no way that I'm letting go of Mueller. That certainly seems, if you follow this Game of Thrones here, where they're going with this.
And I think I said Ray, I meant Rosenstein.
Yeah,
sorry, yes.
To that end, this is not healthy for the American trust. Now, I'm not saying the FBI is beyond reproach, right? Neither are you. But this isn't the right way to go about doing it. You don't burn, I think somebody said, every floor of the FBI down to try and basically look out for yourself. Now, to that end, the president reportedly was telling friends and everyone else that the intention of the memo from him is it's going to discredit the whole probe, the Russia probe. Isn't that another layer of obstruction?
Right. So, look, if individual actors, whether we're talking about Rosenstein, Wray, McCabe, if anybody, there are all sorts of allegations being made against individuals. If anyone did something that they should not have been doing, they should be held accountable. I mean, obviously, I don't think anyone is saying anything different. This is not the way to do that, though. And, exactly as you say, the idea that we didn't really need the president to say it, but the fact that he's saying it so clearly it just makes it all the more stark that the idea that he's now possibly coordinated with Nunes, that was some of the reporting.
And not denied by Nunes today when pressed. Yeah.
Right. And then actively involved in releasing a memo for the purpose of sort of, throwing mud on the people responsible right now for overseeing the investigation into him.
Do you think it's inevitable that the Democratic version of the Minority Report, if you will, is going to come out?
I hope so.
And will the FBI also respond when it comes out? Or are they basically given a gag order? They can't because that could release confidential information. Are they kind of in a box?
Well, right. It is a little tricky because on the one hand, they're saying we don't want these sources to come out. We don't want this information to come out. And frankly, many Democrats are saying that. But if it's going to come out, you've got to get the full picture. I think the answer to that would be once the Nunes memo comes out, the damage may be done. And I assume the Democrats would give the FBI a chance to, if they haven't already, look at and do a deep dive.
I wanted, before I let you get to another development in the Trump probe, not to do with the memo. There are more folks here, more news here, I should say, that the Mueller team is beginning to zero in on whether the Trump White House and perhaps the president himself could be in hot water for obstructing justice. I know this is a new headline, but this one specifically deals with following the disclosure of that campaign meeting at the Trump Tower between Donald Trump Jr. and Paul Manafort, Jared Kushner, several Russians connected to Putin. Remember that one? Well, it turns out that the meeting that Trump Jr. took after receiving emails indicating the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton and they wanted to share it with the Trump team, except that wasn't the rationale that Trump shared with the public, though at the time he said, hey, I love it, quote unquote, about getting dirt on Hillary. Story about the emails in the meeting, it broke last year, came reports at the White House, and the president reportedly himself, they wrote the statement that his son eventually released, saying the meeting was just about Russia adoptions, nothing to do with dirt on Hillary Clinton. Obviously not true. The White House role in that response frightened one of Trump's attorneys, Mark Carollo, who served as spokesperson with the Trump legal team, frightened him to the point that he resigned his position after the statement came out. Now, the book Fire and Fury says he was worried that it was an obstruction of justice. Well, last week, Carollo received a request for an interview with the Mueller team, and he reportedly had a conference call with the White House Communications Director, Hope Hicks, after that statement went out, and the president, and no one else about the Trump Tower meeting. According to reports, Hicks told Carollo that the emails between Trump Jr. and the Russians, quote, would never get out, end quote, which made Carollo think Hicks could be contemplating obstructing justice. Carollo said he abruptly ended the conference call because none of the president's attorneys were on the line and the conversation would not be protected by attorney-client privilege. A lawyer for Hicks denied all of Carollo's allegations. This obviously is one more layer to obstruction here, but it could also be a he said, she said if there's no record of the conversation other than two accounts.
Right. I mean, I think what's interesting about that meeting, and it's sort of something that people have referenced for a while now in terms of building this possible obstruction case against the president and others, is it really illustrates, a very basic principle of criminal law, which is consciousness of guilt. From the beginning, from that pretty dramatic day where, they put out the statement saying the meeting was about Russian adoption, and then it very quickly changed, and the truth came out to some extent, at least, that it was actually, about getting dirt on Hillary Clinton, and there were emails, and there was some finger pointing between Jared Kushner and Don Jr. About who had set up the meeting. They were trying to cover something up there.
They clearly knew they did something wrong.
And so, exactly, consciousness of guilt. I mean, it's a very reasonable principle. And I think this new information really just takes that and highlights it and makes that all the more clear and all the more, sort of makes you scratch your chin about, well, what really did go on at that meeting?
But to me, I think if we brought 20 people in, maybe you'll find two people who believe there's just a giant conspiracy here or a deep state to go get the president. But I think the majority, including people who still support Trump, say, okay, he obstructed. Maybe he obstructed a lot. Some would say he obstructed a tremendous amount. But it seems that even if, and we don't know what Mueller has, but there's ample evidence that there was a systemic effort to thwart this investigation, from who he fired and why, what they attempted to cover up, and the rest. It seems it will only be to confirm what we already suspected. It is how the second part of the probe about the collusion. Do you believe that Mueller has a choice to make right now, which is, I'm going to finish all the obstruction and put that out. That'll buy me more time to finish collusion. Or is he going to lay both out at the same time? He not only obstructed the investigation, but he obstructed it because he was colluding. Does he do them simultaneously or separately?
Obviously, I don't know. I think politically speaking, it would be more prudent to do them together because, as you say, if he comes out just with a finding of obstruction or a recommendation that he be, charged with obstruction or something, whatever form it takes, there's going to be so many people who are going to say, yeah, but I mean, they already are saying it, but there was no underlying crime, so who cares? Well, first of all, as a former prosecutor, I disagree with that.
Me too.
People get prosecuted for obstruction and false statements and the so-called process crimes all the time, and they're an important part of making our system function, and particularly where you have high-profile people in positions of trust that we need to be able to rely on. Those are important in and of themselves. And many people, Martha Stewart, prosecuted for these kind of crimes, even where there was no underlying crime. But, I think the second part of it is, look, is Mueller going to find that there was some underlying crime, which obviously wouldn't be collusion because it's not, but some kind of conspiracy to, throw the election in some way? I don't know, but it could be, remember, it started as an intelligence investigation.
Right.
And so, what we're really going back to is the Russians interfering with the election. And even if there was no criminal law violated, wouldn't the American public want to know, even if you're a Trump supporter, that not only did they actually try to interfere and maybe successfully did, as reports have said, but that people who were involved in the election, who had an interest in it, helped them do that. Even if that isn't a violation of the criminal laws, wouldn't people want to know that? And so isn't obstruction of that?
And the greatest fear for me has always been the report provides damning information, and then there's a collective shrug, at least with all the partisan environment it is. But a conversation for another time. Mimi, great job as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, coming up next, we're getting into the politics of this whole thing. Paul Ryan, he's behind the release of the Nunes Memo. The question is, will that cause backlash in November, and has he made a bad bet here? Or basically he says he's all in at this point, why turn back now?